So would you help me welcome Jordan to the stage?
So I've got a timer going here. Like you said, I'm used to teaching the Psalms class where I have like an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to try and restrict myself. Y'all are very fortunate that you're in the first service and I do have a backstop. Pray for the people in the second service. So thanks, Pastor John. I never know, is it Dr. Pastor John or is it Pastor Dr. John? I haven't figured that one out. If any of you figure it out, please let me know. But yeah, it's been a blessing to get to know the Mrazeks as well. If you haven't had a chance to get to know John and Connie, I highly recommend that you take the time to do it. They just have great hearts and are really, really passionate about helping us grow this community in Christ. Like John said, my name is Jordan Tellman. I have been here since 2018. I've done a variety of different jobs over the course of my career. I went to college expecting that God was going to place me in vocational ministry for my entire career. He called me out of that, but he never called me away from ministry, and I thank him for that every day. I've had the opportunity to serve in multiple churches in a lot of different capacities, but the one that I keep coming back to is really just a desire to bring scriptures to life. And it's something that was done for me at a very young age, and it's something that I really, really enjoy doing, being a part of God doing for others as well. And I get to teach on a topic that, pastors aren't always comfortable teaching on. And so we're going to be talking about tithing, as you can see on the screen there. I'm not steering away from it. We're going to steer right into it. We're talking about tithing. And some pastors don't want to preach on it because it feels like you're preaching for your paycheck. I'm not getting paid, so I'm not preaching for my paycheck. We're all good there. But this is a giving church, and I want to start with that because teaching on tithing to a church that has a demonstrated history of giving is very different than teaching from a church that needs to learn it for the first time. And I'm very blessed to be able to teach this in a church that has demonstrated a giving heart. And how do we know that? Well, we have recent history that can demonstrate that pretty powerfully. You see, there was this thing that happened, 4 years ago now, and it changed the world for charitable organizations. You see, since COVID and since inflation and since interest rates have been rising, across the board, charitable organizations have received less and less giving. A lot of scaling back in ministries and in charities, a lot of downsizing of ministries and charities. And this body has done the opposite. Not only have y'all remained faithful in your giving, but we've actually seen an increase in giving year over year. It's an amazing testimony to what God is doing in and through this community. It's a great thing. And so I have a couple guiding principles that I want us to consider as we're going to talk about tithing, because it is it's an emotional subject. Let's be honest about that. Well, first and foremost, tithing is not tied to salvation. We don't pay to play in heaven. We don't. The payment has already been made by God himself. Jesus came, he lived a sinless life. He died on the cross, taking our sins on him, rose from the dead, showing that he is better, more than our debt. And so there's nothing that we can contribute to our own salvation, and certainly not through money. Ephesians 2:8-9 is, "For by grace we have been saved through faith, not of any works, so that none of us will have a reason that we can boast." Also, Jesus did not come to get rid of the law. He did not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. We can see that on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. You see, the law was given to the children of Israel as a way of doing multiple things. First and foremost, revealing the character and nature of God. Also revealed the character and nature of us. Our inability to live up to the law reveals that we ourselves are not God. I'm thankful for that every day. We're not God. God is God. And so the law itself also became a litmus test for us to evaluate the coming and have come Messiah, Jesus. So when Jesus came and lived a sinless life, we had the law to hold that life against and confirm. But the tithe is part of the law. And the law, while as under the new covenant, we live differently in relationship to the law never went away. Jesus fulfilled it. It is fulfilled in the person of Jesus and the character of God. And as Kurt reminded us a few weeks ago, about a month ago now, it's all God's to begin with. We're just stewards. And so we give back to God what he's already given to us. And lastly, an infinite God can't be added to and you can't take away from. We get to participate with God. In fact, he's called us to participate in ministry with him. And he's called us to participate through joining in ministry, but also through funding ministry. He's called us to that. But God is infinite. And infinity plus one is still infinity. And likewise, when we're a little petulant and deciding to, react to not being happy with God, guess what? Not giving, it doesn't take away from God. It takes away from us, but it doesn't take away from God, because infinity minus one is still infinity. We've got a couple of goals. I want to be very forthcoming up front. A couple goals that I have is, one is I want to give us a biblical reason of why and how we're to give. Now, I am not going to be prescriptive in a percentage, but the Bible does call us to proportionate giving back to God, and we'll take a look at that. Like I said before, this is a giving body. This is a body that is proven to be very generous back to God with what he has blessed us with. I want to encourage us all in our returning to God what is his. I want to be encouraging for us to continue to do so. And I want to encourage us to continue to have conversations with God about what he is calling us to. In any group, there's going to be people that have not yet taken that step towards proportionate giving. And our third goal is to encourage y'all to go home today. I don't want it to be today, but go home today and decide to take that first step. See, God is amazing. He knows where he's called us to, but he also knows that we are broken, sinful, fallen, and utterly incapable on our own. And so he allows us to take progressive steps towards him. And so maybe some of us have been paralyzed. God has made it very clear where he wants us to be, and we're paralyzed to even take that first step because we don't see how we can go from A to Z. But I want to encourage us to take that first step to B. So those are our three goals. Now, as we study any topic, there's lots of different tools in the toolbox to go after and how we tackle it. One of the ones that I found very beneficial in my personal study is the principle of first mention. So if I want to look at a term and understand a biblical term, I go to the first place that term exists. And even within that, you can look chronologically, you can look at the order of books in the English Bible that we have. Sometimes the Hebrew scriptures have it ordered it a little bit differently, but you go back to the first and then you kind of just read topically through the Bible that way. That's what I've done here, and we're going to take a look at the first mention of tithing in scriptures, which is found in Genesis chapter 14. We're primarily going to focus on verses 17 through 20, but we'll read all the way through the end of that chapter. But to set the stage, you have warring kings going on. And there's like a hierarchy of kings, right? So you have empires, but then underneath it, you have kings over city-states. And that's really at the level that we're talking about here. And so you have these 4 kings, and I'm not going to bore you with names. And then you have these other 5 kings. And one of those 5 kings is the king of Sodom. And that's important because this is why Abraham gets involved here. And the king of Sodom, he is named here as Bera. It's a really interesting name. It's an unfortunate name, and maybe it was given posthumously. But the name Bera in Hebrew means son of evil. And those of us that know what's coming to happen at Sodom, that makes sense. It's about to get wiped out in a few chapters. But for now, we have this unfortunately named king, Bera, who's king over Sodom, and these 4 other kings come in and they sack these 5 city-states. And they pull back not only the riches of those cities, but the young fighting-aged men as well, presumably for slaves. One of those men being Lot, Abraham's nephew. Now, one of Lot's men happened to escape or evade, and he and a couple other gentlemen go trying to find Abraham to get him involved. Why are they trying to find Abraham? Well, because Abraham's a rancher. He's moving around. So they had to kind of know, hey, these are the areas that he tends to take his livestock, and, well, what season is it? Okay, he might be here, and they go and they try to find him. And they do. And Abraham grabs 318 of his ranch hands, his men, and he goes to reclaim what was taken. Spoiler alert, he's successful. And that's where we pick up here in verse 17. It says, after his return, that's Abraham's return, from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, Abraham, at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He, Melchizedek, was a priest of God Most High. And he, Melchizedek, blessed him, Abram, and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the young men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Okay, so this is that's the story. What are we going to pull from that? Let's just jump right in. First and foremost, we are to give to God first. So let's look at what Abram did. So he came in with his 318 men and all the other men that he rescued and all of the spoils of war, not only what was taken from the 5 kings, but presumably what was left on the battlefield as well. All of that stuff would have been piled up into carts, onto the back of oxen, camels, whatever they had. They would have taken it in, and it says they met with Melchizedek and the king of Sodom in Salem. That's the future area of Jerusalem. And all of this gets brought in, and it all gets piled up. Let's just pause for a second. If I'm going to pile up my spoils of war, how am I going to pile it? Am I going to put the jewels and the soft gold at the bottom of the pile? Or am I going to put that at the top? I'm going to put that at the top, right? For 2 reasons. One, gold is pretty soft and easy to damage, so I don't want that to happen. But also, I want this whole pile to look like it's that gold and jewels and good quality armor and swords, right? So I want the best to look on top so that whole pile looks like it's all that really good stuff. So they come in and they're piling it up and they're creating a heap. But before he even turns to the Bera, Melchizedek does something. He brings out wine and bread, and they eat, and then a blessing is given. Now, this isn't out of nowhere. This is actually still today how things get done in the Middle East. You don't talk business until you've had a meal, or at least a snack, but there's always going to be food. Always going to be food. And so this isn't weird, this is normal. And then Melchizedek blesses Abram, and Abram, before turning and returning the goods that he reclaimed, he goes to Melchizedek and he offers him a tenth. Question I ask myself when I get to this point is, when do I give back to God? Do I make sure that all my bills are paid, that my family and I are taken care of, and then I return to God what's left over? Well, Jesus addresses this in Mark chapter 12. In Mark 12, starting in verse 41, Jesus is shown as being in the temple, and he's sitting down, and he's sitting across from the treasury, which would be like our offering boxes, and he's watching people put money in the offering boxes, and that may strike you as weird. But he's watching people put them in, and he sees a bunch of rich men come in, and they put in a large sums of money into the treasury. And he sees this poor widow, and she puts in 2 copper pennies, which is described as equaling, or 2 copper coins, which is described as equaling a penny. She puts them in. And then he does something which is actually the most interesting part of that story, which is he tells his disciples, hey, pay attention to this. Now, why is that weird? Because the text is actually saying that Jesus' disciples are not really good disciples. Because in the rabbinic tradition, if you were a disciple and you were following a rabbi, the expectation is that you would be paying attention to the smallest details of what that rabbi was doing. If you followed a rabbi who happened to get injured and was walking with a limp, guess what? You walked with a limp. If your rabbi held utensils with like the caveman grip, guess what? You ate with a caveman grip because you wanted to do what the rabbi was doing. And so for Jesus to say, hey, pay attention, guys. Hey, be good disciples here. You're not looking at what I'm looking at. And he says, look, this woman gave more than all of those others who were contributing because she gave out of her poverty, putting in everything that she had to live on. Now, what's of note here is that Jesus could have excused the widow. He could have said, look what she did. She didn't need to do that. He had an opportunity to create an exception to the tithe. He could have absolutely done that, but he chose not to. He said, instead, he praises her for giving out of her need. I had the opportunity to talk to some friends yesterday, and one of them shared with me a story of when they were newly married and working part-time jobs because they were waiting to get a full-time position in the vocation that God had called him. And money's coming in, but slower than it's going out. And they still were faithful in giving back to God. And they can speak to God's blessing even in the midst of that. My wife and I had the opportunity last year, starting about a year ago this time of year, to be between jobs. I say opportunity somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it was an opportunity for me to put this to the test. Is God faithful? And I was working part-time jobs, and Adrian was working part-time as well, just trying to get expenses to come in. And, it forced us to ask the question, do I trust that God is going to take care of me and my family? That question was easier to answer when it was just the two of us. But when you have got 4 kids looking at you, question gets a little tougher. But God demonstrated himself faithful. In fact, in the book of Malachi, chapter 3, God, through the prophet, chastises the nation of Israel for robbing him by not doing the tithe, but promises that they can put him to the test on this. See if I'm still good. Everywhere else in Scripture, God says, do not put me to the test. But with our finances, God is very, very comfortable. Jesus pulls this forward as well when he talks about how God clothes the birds and the flowers. They don't have to worry about tomorrow. God's got it. You see, and there's a very simple principle that happens when we give back to God. When we give to God first, it frees up the rest of our finances. We don't have to carry that mental and soul level load of how do I be a good steward when we give back to God first, because it changes our hearts, makes us more like he created us to be. Second point, we give to God our best. Let's go back to that story of Abram, right? He brought in all that good. He piled up that nice pile. Doesn't say that in the text of Genesis, does it, though? So how do we know that that's true? Well, in Hebrews chapter 7, it talks about this story as well. And in verse 4, it says that he gave a tenth of the spoils. Now, the word for spoils being used in the Greek here is akrathinion, which actually doesn't mean spoils. We translate it as spoils because it's getting to the point of he gave the best of what he brought back. What it literally means is top. It comes from the word akron, the top. I don't know why Akron is named at the top. Maybe it's just the top of the state. I don't know, but that's where that word comes from. And so he gave the top of this pile. Well, what's the top of the pile? It's the good stuff. He gave his best. So I can just kind of picture Abram going in and just grabbing an armful off the top, and that's about a tenth. Right? He gave the best. Interestingly enough, it never identifies if he gave a tenth of the weight, a tenth of the value. It doesn't identify what the tenth is of, just of the good stuff. He gave the best. This principle is carried forward in the giving of the law. In Leviticus, which is, a nice light read, there's a lot of instructions given in there. In fact, we have the 10 Commandments, but we have 613 additional or total laws that are given in the book of Leviticus, in the Torah. And one of those talks about the giving of offerings. And when the offering is given in chapter 3, verse 16, God says that the fat is mine. Now, that's a weird statement for some of us, unless you're like me and really like food. I love food. And I know that good meat has fat. That's the flavor. Fat is flavor. My mom was a caterer, and she used to cook, and she used to cook with what she called love, but most people called lard. Or maybe other celebrity chefs, instead of lard, will start every recipe with a stick of butter. It's the same thing. It's all fat. The fat is where the flavor is. That's the good stuff. The best parts of the meat were reserved for God. But what's interesting is that later in the Psalms, David will talk about what it's like to walk with God. And when we walk in righteousness, it's described as walking along paths of fat, like rivers of fat. The path of righteousness is like a river of fat. And, thankfully, the English translators don't translate it directly that way. They talk about rivers of abundance, paths of abundance, to help us better connect. But for those of us who like food, it's rivers of fat. We get to walk along the good stuff. God gives back what we give to him. We end up in this almost a competitive cycle of giving with God when we do it right. We're trying to give our best back to God, and God's like, that's cute. Here's my best. It's amazing what God does. Now, how do we give our best? Well, in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the Apostle Paul, writing to a church that's wrestling with how to give, what to give, addresses this. The first two verses of chapter 16 says this: "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside something and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come." So we have a command, right? As I directed the church of Galatia, so you also are to do. Command. But we're commanded three things. First, he says on the first day of every week. So regularity. We're supposed to do this regularly. Now, is Paul saying you have to do this on Sunday? Well, Sunday is what some of our calendars start on. Monday is what others. No, he's not being overly prescriptive here. He's saying regularly. Have a cadence to it. And he says, put something aside and store it up as he may prosper. That is a proportionate term. You see, the word tithe, a lot of us get hung up on this word tithe. It's a tenth, right? That's what tithe means, tenth. We get hung up. Am I really supposed to give 10%? Well, in the law, there was 3 tithes. You gave 2 annually and 1 every 3 years. So that's, 23 1/3? But, we could get hung up on the exact number, or we can see what he's doing, what Paul is telling us here. As he may prosper. As God changes the way he's blessing you, your giving changes accordingly, right? It's a proportionality. If I'm giving a proportion, then when God blesses me with more is coming back to God. If he's blessing me with a little bit less is coming back to God, but the proportion stays. And he says this, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Giving is to be free of emotional manipulation. That's why I started out with that third goal is, if you're not currently giving, go home and decide ahead of time what you're going to give. Don't do it today. I do not want it to be an emotional response. God does not want it just to be a purely emotionally manipulated response. Which raises the question, am I giving my best? It is helpful for some people to think about what God has blessed them with in terms of time, talent, and treasures. And a lot of times when people teach on tithing, they will talk about those things. I personally have found that to be a struggle. Because when I have those 3 avenues, I start to hedge. I'm being confessional here. This is how my fallen, sinful brain works. I can say, well, I can't give my best treasure today, but maybe I can give my best talent instead. Or I can give my best time. Well, no, I'm a salaried employee. I can't give my best time. I'll just focus on my best talent. And whatever my best talent is, that's what I'll give. And that's how my sinful brain works. And so I've found that not to be particularly helpful. But when I think about giving across those types, and I look at each individual giving, I can ask myself, was that really my best? Now, I'm one of those obsessive compulsive type people. If you have a conversation with me, chances are I will replay that conversation 3 or maybe 10 times before I go to sleep that night, looking at all the ways I didn't give my best. I don't know, can anybody else relate to that? Do I have any other ruminators? Yeah, a few. Used correctly, that is very helpful. It helps keep us honest with if we're giving our best. And the answer most often is, at least for me, no. So I get an opportunity every night to go to sleep, redoubling my efforts to give my best. All right, let's look at the third way we're supposed to give. We are to give joyfully. Now, some of you might be asking, where was that in the text? We don't see Abraham being joyful. He wasn't keeping any of that for himself anyway, so I'm sure it was a lot easier to be joyful. But he had already decided, God is the one who blesses me or not. No man will bless me. That was Abraham's words to the king of Sodom. I'm not going to be beholden to you. God's the one that blesses me. Everything else was going to be returned anyways. And he gives off that top of that heap. But the Apostle Paul does talk about the way that we are to give. And he does this in the second letter to the church in Corinth. Okay, anytime there's a second letter, it means that they didn't get it in the first letter. But we should read the letters together, right? So if you see something that's in a 2 Thessalonians or 2 Corinthians, and it's also, that topic is also addressed in the first letter, you should bring those two together and see where did they do well and where did they not do well in between those two letters. Because if he has to bring it back up, he's either encouraging them or he's correcting them, redirecting them. And so in 2 Corinthians, which is, again, pulling forward what we just looked at in 1 Corinthians, that it's supposed to be regular, that it's supposed to be proportionate, and that it's supposed to be free of emotional manipulation. We see and we know later, and by chapter 11, he's going to call it out very explicitly, that there were these Pharisaic Christians, these Judaizing Christians. These early Christians were both Jewish and Gentile, and the Jewish believers in Corinth were teaching a Jesus and salvation, a Jesus and the law. And you have to understand where some of these Pharisaic Jews would have come from. You have the 10 Commandments, and then expanding out to the whole law, you have 613 laws. But the Pharisees were so obsessed with not breaking one of those laws that they expanded it out, and depending on which rabbi or tradition you followed, there was anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 commandments that you would be following, called the hedge law, to protect you from violating the 613 laws, to protect you from violating the 10 Commandments. And so, growing up in that culture, becoming a Christian and accepting the free gift of Christ, understandably might be a little tough. But they taught that you needed to continue to follow these laws in order to earn your salvation. And Paul is correcting that when he says in verse 7 of chapter 9, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Now, if you're like me, you may be tempted to say, God, I'm currently giving here. I would be a lot happier giving a little bit lower down here. That's not what this verse is saying. You see, Paul isn't telling the church in Corinth not to give, not to tithe, or to give less. What he's saying is that we should give to the measure of the charity in our hearts. To better understand this, it's helpful to look at what the early church fathers said while wrestling with this text. And there's a lot you can go to. You can look at Justin Martyr. You can look at John of Christendom. We're going to look at Irenaeus. And he says, and he's writing late 100s, so pretty close. He says this: the Jews were constrained to a regular payment of tithes. Christians who have liberty assign all their possessions to the Lord, bestowing freely, not the lesser portion of their property, since they have the hope of greater things. That's a lot of words to say a very simple thing. We're freed from the law so that we can give more than the tithe. That is how the early church fathers understood what Paul was saying in 2 Corinthians. We joyfully can give more. Now again, I'm not here to prescribe that proportion to you. But a couple questions that I ask myself are, am I limiting the giving of to the charity of my heart? Or am I growing the charity of my heart to the level that God is calling me to give? Put plainly, am I approaching God and my return of the gift to God as a check the box? I give X percent, I'm good. Unfortunately, in my life, that answer has been yes. And let me tell you what happens to my heart when I have a check the box mentality to my giving back to God. I'm not very generous with others. You see, our faith is like a muscle. The word faith itself is an action. It's a verb. My faith is a muscle, and all muscles are either growing or they're atrophying. There is no static. There is no homeostasis when it comes to muscles. You're growing or it's dying and wasting away. We have to be exercising it regularly. We have to be engaging in that conversation with God regularly on our giving. It's a little tough to hear. It's a little tough to wrestle with. It's tough to ask ourselves of it. But we just sang a bunch of really great songs about what God has given to us. Hell lost another one. I am free. What could I possibly give in response to that? How could I possibly be tight-fisted with it? With whatever I've got? Like I said earlier, I had the opportunity to go through a season of underemployment recently. God did something amazing. He showed me a little bit more of his economy. You see, even with 4 kids, even with a house payment, even with just having some part-time jobs, God preserved our family through it in a way that we didn't have to pull from retirement in order to do so, to pull from investments in order to do so. God did the fishes and loaves economy that he demonstrated in the Gospels in my life. I have a tangible experience of that. But you know what the most convicting part of that experience for me was? My lack of generosity leading up to it. God showed me that he had me the whole time. And so now looking back, it's, did I trust him when the going was good? Was I as generous as he was calling me to be during that season or not? And I was confronted with the reality that no, I wasn't. And so even before God blessed me with a full-time job, Adrian and I sat down at the dinner table one night and had the conversation of, when we're through this, and even starting now, God is calling us to be more generous because he's got us and he's demonstrated that. So I want to encourage us. We're going to close in prayer here, but I want to encourage us as we close in prayer, after which Pastor John will come up with some closing announcements, so don't stand up and get going. But I want to encourage us to really wrestle with what God has already blessed us with and engage in that conversation of, God, what are you calling me to give back? And maybe it's been a settled debate for you for some years. I really do encourage you to go home and with your spouse or with your family or just in your quiet time with God. Is this still where I'm called? If the answer is yes, then the answer is yes. If the answer is no, be open to it and have the courage and the strength to walk where God's walking or calling you. And if God's calling you for the first time and you're like, God, I know you're calling me to this proportion, but my faith isn't that high yet. Stair step it. Come up with a graduated system and a plan to get yourself there. If God's called you to, let's say, 5%, do 1% for the first 6 months, 2 for the next, 3 after that. And if you find that your faith is growing faster than your business plan, then move faster than your business plan. Let's close in prayer.